Welcome everybody to Introduction to Website Analytics. We're going to do kind of a broad overview of what one can do with website analytics and then how you think about what you should actually do. So I am Laura Quinn. I am the Executive Director of Idealware. Here's a giant picture of my head so you can see kind of who might be talking to you. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, Idealware we are a nonprofit ourselves. We are a 501c3, and our mission is to provide information to help other organizations make smart technology decisions. So we do everything from very detailed software comparisons all the way up to kind of more strategic thinking about what makes sense for you. We've been doing a lot of work with the legal aid sector, including this series of webinars. We actually were the consultant working with LSC to kind of convene the community to look at the technology baselines. So I've been doing a lot of work in this sector. But I'm excited to be joined by someone who has way more experience in the sector than I do. Terry Ross. Terry, you want to just introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Terry Ross. I'm the Program Director at Illinois Legal Aid Online, and my organization runs the statewide websites in Illinois. We have 4 statewide websites. We have 2 public websites, one in English, one in Spanish, IllinoisLegalAid.org and AyudaLegal.org. And then we have 2 websites designed for attorneys, one for pro bono attorneys and one for legal aid advocates.
Terrific. And a lot of analytics to go along with all of those websites, I suspect, yeah?
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. Great. So what are we covering today? So we're going to start by just defining web analytics and actually to distinguish it from web statistics, which is in fact where we'll be spending a lot of our time today. So we'll be talking through some of the core statistics that you might be interested in about your site, and we'll actually be doing a reasonable amount of live demoing of Google Analytics. And we're going to be looking at the live view of Idealware's Google Analytics account. So it generally goes fairly well, but I'll ask for your patience if live demoing goes awry, because it's a bit scary to do. We'll talk about setting up Google Analytics itself, so what you would need to do if you haven't gotten it set up. We'll talk about beyond Google Analytics. Google Analytics does a lot of things, and there's not a vast amount of reasons to use other tools, but there are some, and we'll talk about them. And then we will wrap up in the last 15, 20 minutes to talk about how to think about analytics as part of your kind of working life. So obviously you've got a ton of priorities. You can't spend 8 hours a week just kind of diving down into the rabbit hole of statistics. And in fact, Google Analytics is a really deep tool that you can easily get lost in. So we'll spend some time after kind of covering a whole mess of things you could conceivably want to look at. We'll cover how you might want to winnow that down to something that makes sense for you. All right, so let's get started in talking a little bit about what web analytics are and what statistics are. So let's start with statistics. So statistics are the data, the numbers, the charts, the graphs that help you understand stuff. So who's visiting, what they're doing there, where they came from, both geographically and site-wise. So these are all things that we're going to be talking about in a lot more detail. Terrific. So those are statistics. What's analytics then? So we're using analytics to mean, okay, so statistics is a bunch of numbers, but you need to use them to find the answers to your question. So you're not just looking at a spade of numbers, which is an easy thing to do, and we'll talk about that later. But it's basically using those statistics so you can take action to meet your goals. Numbers do nothing for you unless you use them to make decisions. Great. Terry, I know that that's a kind of a theme that you feel fairly strongly about. Anything to add about this idea of statistics versus analytics and trying to make sure that you don't dive down the rabbit hole?
Well, I think it's important for people to know that to not get too wrapped up in sort of what are all the specific definitions? So how does Google Analytics define a visit? How do they define a visitor? How do they track somebody's IP address? How do they calculate time on page. So they have answers to all those questions, and you can spend hours sort of agonizing over the fact that a session is how Google Analytics defines what a session is or a visit. And really the most important thing to look at in analytics is to use it as a comparison and to track trends and gaps. So the numbers are less important than how they compare against other things. That's where you see the real value in analytics. And hopefully Laura will show you some actual analysis that we can look at.
Absolutely. Yes, I 100% agree that it's all about change over time, differences between different things on your site, etc. Great. So let's dive in and start talking about some of the statistics that one might be interested in looking at. And we're going to talk a little bit about just kind of how to define this stuff, and then we're going to look at it in Google Analytics and do some live demoing. So let's start with basic volume statistics. So basically, if you want to know, is anybody coming to my site, how would you know that? So there's three main things that you would look at. These terms have gotten a bit confused by the fact that Google Analytics has kindly changed the terms they use in just the last couple of months. So for instance, what used to be called visitors on Google Analytics is now called users on Google Analytics. So we will probably mostly be, me and Terry, you'll hear visitors a lot because that's what most people call them, and that's what they used to be called, but Google Analytics has changed their term. So regardless of what term, so either visitors or users, so this is straightforwardly the number of people who have seen your site over some time period. So Analytics, for instance, defaults to the running month. To show you the past month. This would be the number of people who have seen their site over the month. Page views is also just like it sounds, but it's a number of pages that were viewed by any visitor to the site. So you might have one visitor who saw 3 pages when they came. So they looked at your home page and 2 other pages. That would give you 1 visitor and 3 page views. You then have visits or sessions. So this is another term that Google has just recently changed. So this is the number of trips that users have made to the site. So for instance, if you have Joe here, came to your site 2 different times over the course of the month, and each time looked at 3 pages. You then have 1 visitor. You have 2 sessions or visits, so he was there twice. And you have 6 page views because he came twice and he looked at 3 pages each time. So those are our basic things. We're going to look at those in analytics in just a second. Just before we go there, let me talk a little about hits. People, you hear the term hits thrown around a lot. And in fact, these days when you hear the word hits, it generally is kind of a slangy term that means one of the other ones. It actually means visits, or it means page views, or it means one of those. So it's worthwhile clarifying what people mean. There is an actual statistic called hits, but it is basically useless to you unless you are running a really huge site. It's basically, it's the number of anything pulled from the server. So for 1 page view, you might get 40 hits because there's each graphic and each piece of code and all of that stuff. So that it's useless to you unless you actually really care about the load on your server, which you wouldn't care about unless you have a gigantic site. So let's take a look at what these things actually look like in Google Analytics. So this is Terry, just to confirm, you can see my screen here?
I can. Yep.
Great. Thank you. So this is the default page that if you haven't done anything to Google Analytics, this is what you see when you first come in. So this is an overview of general volume things. So we've got all of the things that we talked about here, and they're for the running month right now, and I'll show you just a second how to change that. So we've got, right here we can see sessions. So this is also visits. I'm getting confused myself with the terminology. And you can see, for instance, that things go up during the week and down on the weekend. This is a pretty typical pattern. As I mentioned, this is actually the Idealware statistics that we're looking at for the live Idealware site. And this kind of idea that it's cyclical, going up and down, is very common. You can change here to see other things. So I can see my number of visitors or users, and the trend is pretty similar. I can see page views, and the trend is also pretty similar. The numbers over here on the side are actually changing. I can also see all of those things at the bottom. So this is my total number of sessions over that time period. Here's my total number of users. Here's my total number of page views. So this is great and all, but it is, in fact, this is just the very tip of the iceberg as to what Google Analytics can do. Let me show you a couple of things that just on this main page can be really useful. The first one is that you are not limited to this month. You can choose any time frame you want. So I can say, well, what I really care about is last week. And I'm going to apply last week. And here I can see just my actual numbers for the past week. Or I can say, okay, what I care about more is the last 5 years. I'm not actually sure where our data starts here. And it will pull all of that 5 years. Now, this 5 years is a little hard to read because it's showing me every day. And you can see it here. I can make it even uglier. I can make it show it by hour. I didn't actually realize that would give me a load time, so we'll wait for it to load, showing by hour, which will be nuts. It may or may not do that. That was a bad idea. But much more usefully, I can, for instance, see this by month, and it will then show me so this is simply the running trend over the month, and I can see what this looks like over time. I can also compare two periods, which can be a really useful thing to do. So let me say I'm going to just do this period, and I'm going to compare to one of the things that's really important when you're comparing is to make sure that if you have these cycles, I'm going to go ahead and apply them, and then I'll tell you what I'm talking about here. So right now, we're still stuck in months, so it's only giving me a dot because I'm comparing 2 weeks based on the month. So here we have the day. One of the things that's really important is to make sure that your cycles are lined up, or it's really hard to see anything. So like, for instance, if I was looking at this period which started on a Sunday, and I was comparing it to this period which started on a Tuesday, it'd be very difficult to see any incremental difference because my cycles would be out of whack. So here I can see that approximately, so blue is the current period and orange is the last period. So basically, the previous week was actually a somewhat busier week for us. If I just go in quickly to mess up my time frames, mess them up by a lot. That's going to be really messed up. Hang on a second. Whoa. The joy of the live demo. Hang on a second. All right. See what we got here. So these are, so these are now out of phase, essentially, in terms of, okay, so this is a weekend for this current period, and this is a weekend for the last period, and it becomes very difficult to actually see anything. You can see stuff like, okay, sessions were down, users were down, page views were down comparatively, so you can get your overall statistics. All right. Just a couple of other things that I'm going to show you on this view, and then we'll go back and talk about some more, some more sophisticated metrics. One of the really interesting things that first of all, you can always export anything you're seeing on any page. So as we delve a little deeper and you see lots of other pages, you can always export them into lots of different things, into Excel or Google Spreadsheets, PDF, so you can send them around. You can also, a really useful feature here is that you can email this to yourself or to other people in the organization. So I can say, all right, I'm going to just email this dashboard to myself every week on Monday, or I can send it monthly, daily, quarterly. I can be really evil. I can send it to everybody in the organization daily until they tell me to cut it out. And I can see what exactly I'm doing and in what format. So that's a really great way to, and you can choose, we're going to be talking a little later about dashboards. So you can lay out your entire dashboard, all the statistics that you want to see, and get it to automatically email it to you. So you don't need to think about coming in here. Instead, statistics come to you. All right, so that is kind of our overview of just kind of the overall volume statistics. Terry, anything to add about kind of volume without going into any of the obviously considerable slice and dice and stuff we can do in other by clicking around Google?
Well, I guess the one thing I do want to say about two particular metrics on this page and two metrics that are frequently used and looked at are the session duration and the bounce rate.
Yep.
And so something to keep in mind with those two things is that Google, the way that Google Analytics works is it uses a tracking code that is placed onto each page of your website, and that informs Google when somebody comes and visits that page, right? So one of the problems with that model is that if somebody just comes and visits one page on your website and then they leave, they go to a different website or they close out their browser, it never records the session duration because there's no other point in time for Google to relate to on that visit, on that tracking code. So when you see the average session duration, what you're actually looking at is the average session duration of people who visited more than one page on the website. So I think that's an important distinction to make. The bounce rate also is important because I think that a lot of people make a lot out of the bounce rate, but when for websites like all of ours, where people are looking to answer a question, right? They often come, they do a search, they get to a page on our websites where they find the answer, and then they leave because they got the answer, right? So they only see one page. Google considers that a bounce. It doesn't distinguish good bounces from bad bounces, right? Because it can't track how long somebody was actually on that page, looking at that page, or reading through it. And so I would keep both of those things in mind as you go forward and start exploring with analytics.
And I think it goes directly to what Terry mentioned before, and we'll be looking at these in more detail and kind of comparing them across the site. Because as Terry mentioned, these basically have very little meaning in a vacuum. Is the fact that our average session duration is 1 minute and 31 seconds. Is that good? Is that bad? It has no basic intrinsic value. It's only it only makes sense to compare it to our own site over time or page by page, which is what we're going to be looking at next.
Right.
So the same with bounce rate. It has no intrinsic value.
One other thing that's really important to think about, and Laura really mentioned this, that you're embedding a small piece of code on your website, so it's tracking what's happening when people load web pages, but other content on that page, which matters a lot to legal services organizations, such as a publication that is downloaded or a video that is watched or a slide presentation that is downloaded or watched, are not tracked by Google Analytics. So a lot of programs will use another piece of software to get that data. So embedding a YouTube video or using a separate link tracker to get that, because you're only getting those surface analytics of the website.
So there's actually a fair amount that's possible with Google Analytics. I'm not quite sure about video, but documents, it does not do out of the box, but you can add some basic code to, and we'll talk about how to set it up later. So documents can definitely be tracked within Google Analytics as they kind of show up as a page, and you can get page level stats about them. Which is, really important to us as well as to a bunch of other organizations. But it definitely is true that they're not going to show every interaction, every click on the site. And something like YouTube is going to be way better for getting, how many people actually watched your video than Google Analytics. Great. And someone actually has mentioned that you can do video as well, so you can embed code in the Google Analytics to do video. Great. Let's move on and talk a little bit about kind of how to apply some of the stuff that, in fact, Terry has already talked a little bit about. So let's talk about, so we're going to go through 4 categories here. We just talked about volume. We're going to talk about content right now. After that, we're going to talk about kind of visitor behavior and demographics. And then we're going to look at traffic, so where people came from, where people go, things like that. And we're going to wind up with some more complex things like conversion and stuff like that. Let's talk a little bit about what we mean by these basic content statistics. So when we're thinking about what content, so what documents, what pages are popular on the site, you might measure that in page views again. So basically to say, all right, well, this page has had 100 page views, while this other one only had 25. What pages people enter your site on, so basically where it's likely that your home page has some entrances on it, but it may not even be the top page on your site for how people are getting there. You can also see where people left, so what pages were they on when they left your site altogether. Not necessarily a terrible thing. Logically, they need to leave some time, but if it's your home page, then that's probably not. If your home page is your #1 exit page, that's probably not a good thing. And Terry talked a little bit about the bounce rate. This is the percent of visitors who only view a single page. So let's look at how this applies in Google Analytics. So in addition to this main dashboard, there is an enormous amount of stuff in this left-hand bar here. So this is your navigation bar, and there is all of this stuff. I don't, in fact, have all of this open. I only have it open to things that I'm actually going to show you. So there's a vast amount more here. So we're just going to touch the surface in what we're actually looking at here. But find my site content. So we can go to, so under behavior, so this has also been redesigned relatively frequently. So this is now a behavior section, and we can look here at the content on the site. And to me, the major meat here is if I scroll down here, this is showing me every page on my site, and it defaults to an order of page views. So so we have relatively user-friendly names. We're just going ahead and using the file name. You can also get this to show the page title if your page title is more meaningful than so it's right up here. I could choose to look at it by page title, but it would be less useful for our particular site. So what you're seeing here is this is our online survey article, which is in fact the most viewed page on our website, more so than this little slashy thing, which is our homepage. And this is a set of articles. So this is basically all of our content in page view order. So, and you can see other things here. You can see the average time on page compared to each thing. You can see how many people entered on this page, what the bounce rate for this page was. And so this is great, but this type of table throughout all of Google Analytics becomes even more powerful through these views on the top right here. So, for instance, I particularly like this comparison view. Where I can click it and I can see, all right, so this is rank ordered on page views, which I choose here, so I could choose to rank order it. And it's also showing me a bar based on page views, which is not particularly interesting. I just get a bigger bar on the top. But I could show it by something else. And I could now see, okay, here's my top pages on my site, and I can see how long people spent looking at those pages compared to other pages on the site, with this bar being the average. And a lot of, not shockingly, a lot of the stuff that people really want to see has more page views, has more time on the page than other, with the exception of our homepage, which has less time spent on page, which in my mind is a good thing. People are clicking off our homepage to go read something that they want to know about. And so you would hope that, in fact, our articles, the longer articles would have more would have more time on site. And that is something that is kind of a trend across our site. Great. Just another thing so we can see also the entrances here. So how many people entered on this particular page. And like your site, Idealware is primarily a content site. So it's primarily articles that people come to see. And so in fact, you can see that the more people came to the page, the more people in general started on that page. So people are coming directly to pages is what this essentially means to me. Great. Let me just quickly show you exit pages. So we talked about that. And so I can see here, these are the pages that are the top pages on the site from which people left the site. So which is, as I said, not necessarily a terrible thing. They need to leave for some place. And like, for instance, our online surveys is still the same, still the top one, meaning a lot of people came, they looked at our online surveys article and then left, which is to me a totally valid behavior. And you'll notice that our homepage is no longer in the top 10 for exit page when it was on the page view. So that's a good sign to me. Terrific. So that's kind of an overview of kind of just a very surface level overview of some of the things that you can see and slice and dice in terms of content. Terry, are there other things that in terms of, we're going to look at click views down the road a little bit, so kind of looking at the path through the site. Is there anything else that you think about or look at in terms of just understanding how content is doing compared to each other?
Sure. So landing pages is also, I think, an interesting thing to look at because, it tells us what content people are coming to, what they land on, right? So either via a link on somebody else's website or a search result. And so I think that these are really, when you're sort of prioritizing what to pay attention to on your website, what to pay closest attention to, what should I pay the most attention to? We all have limited time and resources. For quality assurance purposes, what content needs to be closely monitored and updated more than others. This is a good place to start, is to look here and see where are people landing on us, and are these good pages for them to land on, right? So is there information on this page about the organization? Is the navigation easy to use? Is it clear that there are other options for them if they have another question that's related to the content that they're on, that's not getting answered by that content? So all of those things are important to look at. Sort of if a new user is landing on this page, is it useful to that person? And so I think that's a good one to look at as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, and if you haven't looked,
we worked to help evaluate a site recently, and two of the things they were focusing on was membership, and then also some frequently asked questions that artists who came to that particular site had. They looked at redesigning some of their blog pages because they saw that people were just going directly to their blog content, and those key pieces of content weren't highlighted on those pages, which allowed people to find out a lot more about the organization after the redesign.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and if you haven't looked at this for your site, you'll likely be amazed at how relatively low on the list your homepage is. So only 55% of people who come to our site actually come through the homepage, meaning 45% of people come to some other page. So you really need to think about the experience from other pages, as both Brian and Liz are saying, or forgive me, Terry. Great. Any questions on anything we've talked about so far? Do keep in mind that you can ask questions through the chat, and we can try to take them on. It is a little difficult to monitor the chat while I'm demoing, but I do have it up now. So definitely let me know. As I mentioned before, I'm literally sitting alone in my office talking to myself. So if you have questions, definitely bring them on, and we'll see what we can do. All right. So let us move on from content statistics to think about visitor statistics. So things like how long do visitors spend on the site, or otherwise time on site, otherwise now called by Google engagement. There's also some there's some old school visit information that you can know. So where are they located? What software are they using? New versus returning, mobile or not mobile. Google has also very recently introduced the idea of actually being able to see demographics, which is a little scary but useful, that you can see things like age and gender. We, in fact, have not yet put the tracking code on the Idealware site to be able to track that new stuff, so I can't show it to you, but I can show you where it lives. It can tell you things that Google knows about people through kind of the scary interwebs, or obvious things like software, time on site. It can't tell you things that might be obviously useful to know, like, for instance, whether they're an attorney or they're a potential client, unless you somehow can track that through their behavior. So to basically, so people who are clicking on a lot of information for attorneys, one can suspect is an attorney. If you have a member login, then you could get whatever information you want about that person and then know exactly who is logging in and where. But otherwise, you are limited to things that Google can know about people. Let's take a look at that stuff in action. So we've got a whole thing here on audience. So let me just show you the demographics. These are the demographics that we haven't yet set up. So it will show me age and gender. I could then do things like segment on age and gender. I'll talk a little bit about segmenting in just a bit. I'm not this just gets more and more alarming to me. I actually need to look into what these affinity categories are, but I kind of suspect they're kind of shopping-aligned categories, so you can see some of their interests. So these are not yet set up on our site. They're very new, but are kind of interesting and scary. Some things that are fairly obviously useful are things like location. So I can see, so if I just click on location, it by default shows me the world. I can click in to see the United States. I can then click in to see Illinois, for instance, and I can then see here is the traffic to Idealware from places in Illinois. So each of these is a bubble. I can click in more. I'll just show you another view of this in a second. And you can see that an awful lot of people in Chicago and around Chicago are using the Idealware site, not so many in other places. And I can actually see this view listed by place name. Unfortunately, you can't easily see this by things like zip code or county, which might be pretty darn useful. But so you basically see it by city name. But you can, for instance, dump this and then map it. It does, in fact, stay the same. You can also, and I'm going to show you a little later, you could filter by this stuff. So one of the things that Terry mentions that she's done is basically filter all their views to seeing, okay, what does it look like for Illinois? So what is, page views, what does traffic, what does this look for Illinois, and what does it look like for outside of Illinois? Because obviously Illinois is a key focus for them. So that's another thing that you can do with these demographics. You can use basically anything I'm showing you, you can then segment on, and I'll show you segmenting in a bit. Other things that are pretty interesting to know about your audience are what devices they're using. So, for instance, we can see here that over this time period, 87% of my of users came in on a desktop. 8% came in on a mobile device, so a mobile phone, and 4% came in on a tablet. So if, for instance, I hadn't given any thought to people on a cell phone or a tablet that says, wow, 8% of people who are viewing my site may be seeing a really unoptimal view. I could also look at devices. So I can see literally each. So here is my highest device that people are using is an Apple iPhone, followed by an iPad, etc. You can see a lot of that stuff. Another just kind of useful things to keep your eye on are things like what used to be called time on site, now called engagement. So this is the amount of time that people, so basically this is the number of people, number of sessions that were less than 10 seconds long. This is the number of sessions that were 10 to 30 seconds. So under 10 seconds, you know, is probably certainly enough to look at the page. And so as one of the big Google trainers says, it's certainly enough time to say, I came, I puked, I left. So basically, I came, it was not the site at all that I thought it was. I hated it. It didn't have any of the information. So something like that. It's also, honestly, 10 seconds is probably enough to scan a page, to bookmark it, to mark it for later, to print it out, something like that. So it's a little hard to know what's in this bar. And then when you get beyond, you know, 1,800 seconds, you begin to wonder whether they've just, you know, left their browser open or things like that. But this is kind of an interesting thing to know about. Perfect. All right, so that's my look at kind of visitors. Terry, can you talk a little bit about both anything you use within analytics and just a little bit about the idea of tracking demographics off your actual member sign-in things?
So we have not enabled the demographic stuff either. And part of that is because we want to make sure that it won't require us to change our privacy policy in terms of use on our website, which is something to think about. When you enable the Google Analytics tracking code, you want to make sure that you actually look at your privacy policies and your terms of use on your website to make sure that they don't need to be revised, because essentially you're allowing Google access to how people are using your website and allowing them to track IP addresses and devices and all of the things that Laura has told you. One thing to note for us, one of the metrics that we have chosen not to look at least for our public websites, is the visitor metric. And the reason for that is because we do a lot of outreach to libraries and places that have public access computers. And so knowing, a little bit about sort of how Google Analytics tracks sessions and visitors and return visitors, we have decided just not to pay as close of attention to that particular statistic for the public websites because we're so focused on points of public access. And so we look much more at sessions or visits and page views.
So something like new versus returning is really hard to know because you'll see lots of returning people because it's people who are, again, on the library computer. Yeah, that's what you're saying.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, I think that there's probably a mix. There's probably new visitors who get counted as return visitors and vice versa, who are on public access computers. Now, for the attorney sites, we do pay attention to that because, of course, our goal is to have people come to us and then have people come back to us repeatedly, right? For resources. For the public sites, just because of sort of the way we have framed our outreach efforts and our access to justice channels, we've chosen not to look at that.
Yeah, on the privacy policy side of things, the model privacy policy that LSNTAP put together last year does have a section on Google Analytics specifically.
Great. Terrific. Anything else to add, Terry or Brian, or any questions, certainly, before we move on and talk a little bit about traffic? Great. Find my slides here there. All right. So traffic is basically a search engine term or an analytics term for how people are getting to your site. And there's two major categories. There's many categories one could divide this into. But there's the idea of websites that are directing people to you. So these are potentially partners or potentially LSN Tap or LSC or other folks like that are directing people to you. The library site is referring to you. There's a search engine keywords. So you can look at the words that people are using to find your site. As we think about that type of thing, we can also add in kind of a more complex idea of things like clique analysis. So not only where did they come from, but where did they go? How many are clicking on what to go to what on each page? And in fact, if you're looking at that, then you can start to think about things like goal conversion. So how many actually made it to the idea of signing up for your newsletter, for instance, or this is hard to track for reasons that probably both me and Terry will talk about, but you could conceive of, but probably you can't technically, but you could theoretically track, for instance, how many people have created a document on your site, like for instance, have gone through the A to J and created the document. Let's look through, and we'll talk about that in more detail as to why that is probably not possible for you and when it might be possible. Excuse me. Let's go through and look at both these high-level traffic and then this more detailed stuff. So let's see. So let's start with the idea of so traffic. So we can see here, so I've just navigated to all traffic in my sidebar. And this is showing me kind of just an overview of where all our traffic is coming from. So this is telling me that for the Idealware site, we've gotten organic Google searches, so organic as opposed to paid. So this is not coming off an ad. This is coming from just someone searching. So 75% of our traffic is coming from someone searching and finding us on Google. About 15% is not coming from anywhere that Google knows of, which probably is mostly coming from emails. So we or somebody else is sending an email and they're clicking onto our site. This could also be just people saying, oh, I bet Idealware has that information and typing us in. Here is Bing search traffic, and here is we begin to have some actual partners. So TechSoup is a big partner of ours. And we can look at that more in detail. So I'm clicking on all referrals on the left-hand bar here. And here is the list of all of the people over this particular time period, which I think is about a week. Yeah, it's about a week, who have come from other partner sites. So TechSoup is a partner. Salsa Labs, this is actually our own registration for trainings and such, so this is a little less interesting. But Council of Nonprofits is an interesting one, which I'm kind of, when I was going through to rehearse for this demo, I was kind of surprised to see here. I'm kind of curious to see what it is. And in fact, I can click on that and see where on that site people are coming from. So they're actually coming from a number of places. So they're coming from the social media page, the communications planning page. They're coming from tools for management. So there are links on that site to, and I can go actually click through to see what they are, but they're either to the Idealware site as a whole or to specific pages. So this is a look at where people are coming from other than from search engines. And this can be a really useful thing to know because this would, and I can do the same slice and dicing here that we talked about on other pages to potentially to be able to see, all right, I want to see we'll just do the same graph for the, let's do pages per session. So this is now showing me the kind of the value of each of these referrers. So that basically people who come from TechSoup are about average to how many pages they look at on our site. People who come from Facebook are particularly high. They are much more likely to look at more pages than from other things. Digital Loom is a particularly low one. Digital Loom is actually our hosting company, so I suspect they have a testimonial or something on it. So this is a really interesting thing to say, for instance, wow, this Facebook traffic seems to be pretty high quality based on, just this immediate thing here. Maybe I should really think about trying to drive more traffic from Facebook. Or, TechSoup is pretty good compared to a lot of our referrers. Maybe we should try to get TechSoup to mention us more often. And in fact, I bet if I show more rows here, so I've just clicked to go from 10 rows to 50 rows, I can find some other things that are particularly high quality. Here's an interesting one. People who have clicked through from idealist.org are way more likely than others than to see multiple pages on our site. And in fact, I'm not quite sure what they're coming from or what exactly they're clicking on idealist.org. So that might be an interesting thing to dive into more. All right. So I can also see, excuse me. I can also see keywords. So I can see what people are searching on Google to get to the Idealware site. So unfortunately, the vast amount of this is, okay, we don't know. So 91% of people who came to your site, we don't know what keyword they used. But certainly the order of other things is pretty interesting. So a lot of people searched on Idealware. But then you get kind of some interesting things that people are finding us just because they want comparative information between Indiegogo and Kickstarter, which this is in fact a blog post on our site. So I would suspect that we are rated very highly on Google for people who want to compare these two. Sponsorship packages is kind of a bizarre one. We have an article on putting digital benefits in sponsorship packages. But then you've got, accounting packages, survey tools. CiviDesk is an interesting one. If we were to go to more than a week, we'd probably be able to see something, because this is only 5. So this may or may not. This could be just a weird happenstance. Great. So that is where traffic has come from. Terry, Brian, anything to add on kind of this idea of where people have come from before the site, before we dive into kind of what they did, where they went on their site, or thinking about things like goals?
No, it's definitely a great way to forge partnerships and cross-promote content. We've definitely seen with some of our blogs that other legal-related sites are sharing that content, and then we can do a guest post or something else there. It's really an important source of data there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and for us, I would say that, if you compare traffic that has come to us from referrals, so somebody else linking to us, against traffic that comes to us from search, we have a much higher user engagement for referral traffic. So people are looking at more pages when they come from a referral, and they're on the pages for longer than they are when they come from the search. And the same thing with the direct traffic. The other thing I wanted to point out. I'm sorry, what was that, Brian?
Oh, we definitely see that same trend. Referral sites are much more engaged users.
Right. And the other thing about referral sites, too, is that boosts your search engine optimization. So Google looks at that when that's part of its algorithm, right, is somebody else linking to your site, or a bunch of other people linking to your site? And if so, then it's going to boost you up in their search results. So that's the other benefit, sort of ancillary benefit of pushing more people to link or to agreeing to cross-link with other organizations.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, and this is just a quick analysis of what Terry, so this is one of the ways, there's a couple of ways that you could do the analysis that Terry mentioned. So this is actually looking at and seeing exactly what Terry just mentioned, that interestingly, for some reason, Bing has fairly good pages per session, but otherwise all of these ones that are negative are search, while we've got big positives from the much more related, Council of Nonprofits, ask.com, about.com, etc. Great. All right, let's talk a little bit about kind of click tracking, of seeing users flow through the site. So this gets to be a tremendous rabbit hole, but it's also really fascinating. So I've just, under audience, the audience here, I've just gone all the way down to the bottom of the audience nav bar and clicked on user flow. What this is showing me here is, in fact, this is probably, so it's showing me automatically country, which I must have changed at some point, because now let's leave it like country. So this is showing me in the United States, here's where people were most likely to go. So there was a lot of sessions, and in fact, a lot of them went, so if you look at the main trends, so in the United States, many of them went to simply the articles page. So this is the overall article. Sorry, I'm trying to point to things and it brings up the pop-up. This next thing down, the second thing down, is our surveys article. Then it's our homepage. And I can also, sorry, I'm thrown off by the fact that I am in country, which is where I'm not used to being. Do landing page. So this is basically just showing me a similar thing. So basically, it's now where it's coming from. Then I can see that from the survey page, a lot of people continue to the survey page. From these other pages, I can go to, a lot of people went to the article page as opposed to the other one. So a lot of people went to the surveys page, a lot of people on the homepage. You see a lot of cross-mixing, that there's not as much flow on our site as there is in many sites. This is an interesting one. So of people who actually started on our homepage, where did they go after that? And the answer is probably they went to a navbar item. They went to articles, they went to reports, they went to about, they went to topics. So this is the type of thing that you can dive down into and really glean a lot of information on. Brian was actually telling us that he used this to really kind of understand how and where people were going to make sure that things were cross-promoted appropriately. Brian, you want to talk through that a little more?
Yeah, I mean, this is very interesting, as it kind of shows the flow of where people try to find things. We have definitely noticed that people have trouble finding some of the videos on our site. So we've been able to cross-link some of those in the new design that we're going to be putting forward on our site. But this flow is very important, especially when you have a larger amount of information that people will browse through.
Right. Fantastic. And Terry, anything to add here?
No, I find this extremely confusing, and every time I look at it, I close it immediately. So I'm glad that Brian, that you have the courage to have used it effectively.
Yes, and I like that Terry's immediate reaction to this was to put in training videos. Yes, I think that's a great reaction, that a lot of this stuff, as you get to more sophisticated things, you're probably not going to be able to intuitively figure it out. And in fact, you saw me thrown off by simply being in someplace I didn't expect to be. Not that I'm certainly some amazing analytics whiz. But yes, is that some of this stuff is, you want to make sure that you have, as we're going to talk about in a minute, you have a purpose and you have questions to answer by being here, and not just kind of like, what can I see? Because you can see a lot. Let me talk about just two more kind of tools in your toolbox for thinking about how to use Google Analytics. Let me think through where the best place is to show you this. let's go back over here. So you can, what's going on here, interestingly, for refers. So one of the things that you can do is you can set goals. So you can say, okay, I want to track when somebody, for instance, hits the e-news thank you page. So for us, this is the fact that they've gone through the site and they've hit the e-news, thank you for signing up for the e-news page, implies that they have signed up for e-news. So this is almost a trial goal that we've set up to kind of see how things are working. And what we could do there. And we can definitely see some differences between things like, so this is interesting here. So TechSoup, we've gotten, let me actually do this to a bigger period so we can actually see more data here. So let's do this for a year. Yeah, by the time you've got like one person sign up, it gets a little less interesting. So 47 people have signed up having come from TechSoup. Only 10 have signed up coming from, I need to figure out what T.co is. LinkedIn, interestingly, really good source of e-news. This goal value in dollars is simply, you'll notice that it is suspiciously equivalent to, in fact, we have just said it. There's some places where it's easier to look by dollar amount than it is by numbers. So we've just said that each, arbitrarily, that each e-newsletter thank you is equivalent to $1. And it makes it easier to slice and dice in a few places. But so that's a kind of an interesting, so for you guys, so you could, in theory, as I mentioned, like know, for instance, how many people had gone through, like, for instance, an intake wizard or something like that on your site. The key downfall here tends to be that you need to be able to embed the piece of Google code that I will indeed. Someone asked about setting this up in the first place. I will talk about that. But you need to have control over the actual place that they end up. So, for instance, you can sign up for a training on our website, but we can't track it as a goal because they leave our site officially and go to a provider site that doesn't allow us to put the Google tracking code on. And the same is true with A to J, that Terry has mentioned that she's actually done a fair amount of work to try to get the tracking code onto A to J without much success yet. Yeah, Terry, you want to talk about that?
Oh, well, is anybody on the call from Pro Bono Net or LHI? I'm just curious.
Anyone hit *6 if you want to speak for LHI or Pro Bono Net?
So one of the things I think would be extremely useful to us as a national community is to have LHI in particular share tracking codes with all of our sites, right? Because the way that the automated documents work is that people are taken from our site to the LHI site, and there they complete their documents. And if they're in A to J is currently in Flash, and Flash is very tricky. You can't embed a Google Analytics code. Well, I shouldn't say that. You can embed a Google Analytics code into a Flash based module, but it's very complicated. A to J is moving out of Flash and going to HTML, and once they do that, then we should be able to use the tracking code to see where people are exiting during the interview. So this is going to be a huge benefit to all of us to see sort of where are users getting tripped up, or where are they exiting, certain screening questions. It's going to be really useful for usability. For LHI, for interviews completed, it would be really useful if we could do a cross tracking code. So they put our tracking code on their website or their landing page, right, that's specific to the Illinois form. And And then there's a destination goal page, right? So everybody knows that once you fill out the automated documents, you end up on a page that says, I want to email those to myself. I want to get the document. I want to print it off. I want to save my answers. And it would be really useful if we could get that tracking code, and then we could see those in our own Google Analytics accounts, right? And LHI could also see sort of how people are coming to their website as well. And so I'm putting that out there into the community as something. I have talked to a few people at LHI. Doug Carlson and Miranda were on a call over the winter, and we did talk about this. And this would be the advantage of doing this would be that we would get some statistics in actual real time versus waiting 3 months to get them on a quarterly basis, which is the way that they work now. So I'm going to put that out there for folks to think about.
Fantastic. Terrific. Let me show you just one last very useful thing that you can do. So in the slice and dice rabbit hole that is Google Analytics. So we are now back to just the view where we started. So the audience overview. I'm just going to flip this so it's a more useful thing. I can not only, so this is everything. I'm seeing all my sessions, but I can, by clicking this little downy arrow on most any screen, I can choose to see only some particular people, and it gives me a bunch of defaults. So, like mobile traffic, I could choose to see only mobile traffic. I could see, referral traffic only. I've actually set up my own. I can fairly straightforwardly create a new segment. So I can't use this. I could, in theory, use this information like age and gender, but it's not set up on my site, so it's not going to do anything. But location, for instance, might be a really useful thing to you. So you might. I quickly set it up one for the United States. You could certainly do one by state. I'm a little nervous to. I'm going to try it. I'm a little nervous that I'm going to get like exactly the string right and all of these things to make this work. But it is, if I knew that was exactly what Google Analytics called Illinois, then this would definitely work. So we're going to save that. And it's going to add a tab. So we're going to, so this has now refreshed, and we've got this little tabby thing here. So it's refreshed, so it just did seem to work. I have data here. This is showing me only Illinois, and I can flip back and forth between Illinois and all other traffic, which obviously if we were in Illinois, which we are not, but Terry is, this would be a particularly useful thing to do. So filtering is really quite easy. And you can also, one of the things I haven't mentioned is almost anything, you can click this button here, this Add to Dashboard button, and it will add it to your main view. So you can basically just say, all right, well, I want to see visits from Illinois versus visits in the rest of the world, and I'm just going to add those to my dashboard, and that's what I want to send to myself. So you can customize this thing really highly so it does what you want it to do. So I can do Illinois here, I can do United States here, I can do all sessions here. And this is going to make little tabs for each of these is what this is going to do. And show them comparatively. So here's Illinois. Well, so for Idealware, it's comparatively low. That there's a lot of people from the United States and a lot of people from the world and not very many from Illinois. But probably would not be true for Terry's site. Terry, Brian,
right,
anything? Sorry, go ahead.
So we do this, and this is actually very useful. This geographic segmenting for our Spanish website because only less than 30% of our visits come from Illinois, and we get are looking at the world map on our Google Analytics that are set up for Ayuda Legal IL is really interesting because people come from all over the world to that website. Most of the people who come to us from outside of the U.S. Don't stay on our site very long, and our analytics show us that, which is not surprising. People inside the U.S. have a tendency to stay, even if they're from outside of the state of Illinois. So we get a lot of traffic from the places where you would expect, from New York, from Florida, from Texas, from California. And so this is, this segmentation I find is extremely useful for us in using our public websites.
Great. And we got a question in regard to language. I don't know much about it, so I can click on language and I can show you. I'm just going to take off these two comparisons. I can show you what it looks like. I would interpret this as being the default language of the browser that the person has used. I don't know much more about it than that. Terry, have you used language at all?
We don't pay too much attention to this. If you scroll over, Laura, in the language column, there's a little question mark bubble, and this will tell you how Google defines this, which is very helpful if you want to know sort of what it means to Google.
Yep. So it's a language setting in your user's browser. So that may mean something or not, depending on exactly what question you're trying to answer. So potentially a good transition to our next portion of the program. Terrific. If you have other questions about analytics itself, we can certainly attempt to answer them. But I'm going to move on a little bit to talk about just briefly setting this up. And then talking about kind of going beyond Google and thinking about, not diving down the rabbit hole, but in fact using this in a useful way. Sorry. All right, so let's talk a little about setting this up. So we've talked a lot about Google Analytics. In fact, Google Analytics is in the process of being replaced by something called Universal Analytics. It will, so right now, if you try to set up analytics, it's likely going to make you sign up for Universal Analytics, which is very similar. It's somewhat more powerful in some things, but it is quite similar to what we've just looked at. And we are not yet on Universal Analytics, which is why I haven't demoed it, but also I figured that most of you are already set up, so that's what you'll get. Regardless, so the setup for Universal Analytics looks to be, as far as we can tell, pretty similar to what it has always been, that you'll need somebody with a little bit of HTML knowledge to do potentially a couple hours of work to embed a small piece of code in basically a snippet of language that analytics gives you in every page of your site. Likely, however your site is set up, it's unlikely that will involve actually going to hundreds or thousands of pages by hand to embed this piece of code. It's more likely that there's a template page or there's a search and replace that can be done to fairly speedily put this piece of code, even if you had millions of pages on your site, to do it in a couple of hours.
Great. A common way that people do it is just drop it into their footer block, which normally gets it to all their pages, takes less than 10 minutes.
Yep. So if you don't know HTML, you'll probably need to hire someone, but if you do hire someone, it's not a gigantic project to do. This is a question that people ask less than they used to, but people had heard for a long time that analytics underreports compared to other things. And that is potentially true, but like we've said, you're not actually, you can't obsess over what these actually are. So in fact, this is different numbers from a tool called AW Stats compared to Google Analytics. But the general rule is that because these numbers don't have any essentially inherent meaning in the world, because it depends on exactly how they're defined, you want to compare against yourself. You want to compare pages, refers over time, so you can actually know what you're comparing to.
Yeah, and just to add something there, Laura, we used to use AW Stats, and we technically still have it, but we just have stopped looking at it. And AW Stats does result in higher numbers, or it did for us at least. So when we sort of transferred over to Google Analytics entirely from AW Stats, we included a little paragraph in all of our grant reports about why our numbers looked a little lower than they did, the year before. Google Analytics really is the industry standard, and so I think that right now there's really nothing else to use. There are a number of paid tools that you can use that will actually result in little better reporting and not so much sort of falling down the rabbit hole as Laura keeps saying. But Google Analytics is the industry standard. It's the best free tool out there, and Google is actively working on it at all times to improve it and to offer more robust reporting and better interface.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so just a very quick detail behind what Liz, I don't know why I want to call you Liz, what Terry is saying. So why wouldn't you use Google Analytics? It's actually hard to come up with reasons. So if you have super specialized needs, super big site, you're driven insane by frequent changes to features and interface, that could be reason. It's going to so in the free tool arena, you've got something like AW Stats, Webalizer, Analog. They are enormously less powerful than Google Analytics. So basically, they're just essentially showing you numbers and giving you no slice and dice. It's going to Google Analytics requires a little more setup than those other things. You also need to think about what Terry mentioned before, kind of the privacy implications. So there's no specific privacy implications for you or your users or visitors, but there's kind of this general concern about Google potentially being collecting so much data that they could do really nasty, evil things with it, which they haven't done yet. But they're collecting your data if you use Google Analytics, and to think through whether you mind what they might do given if they had everybody in the world data. Why would you use why would you move beyond the free? Support, configuration help. If you need sophisticated support for pages that are behind a password protection, so like a member site, so you can do some things with Google Analytics, but it becomes a little limited. So if you're looking at dynamic content, flash content, things like that, as Terry says, it's going to be complicated to set it up, so you might want to start to think about paid tools. Deep integration, your ability for your analytics staff members to do statistical and mining analysis. So this is not likely to apply to any of you guys. If you were to go beyond it, something like click tracks is probably a logical next step, but you can see it starts at about $80 a month hosted. So it's not only not free, it's pretty expensive. Web Trends, Omniture Site Catalyst, really expensive, so $400 a month plus for really things that go beyond Google Analytics. You can get Web Trends for a lot less, but it's not likely to give you as much functionality for the majority of sites. All right. Any quick, we're running a little short on time here. Any quick thoughts, Terry or Brian, in regard to any of that before we kind of try to keep ourselves from going down the rabbit hole that we keep referring to?
No.
Oh, looks good.
All right. So there's kind of, if you imagine 3 ways to think about analytics, you've got this kind of common idea, and analytics as therapy. So, my God, they're coming. They love me. They like our stuff. Or the opposite. Like, why aren't people coming? I hate you all. Obviously, this is probably not super productive. It probably resonates with a lot of us. We've all done it. But it's not really going to be a great use of time. You could also think of analytics as exploration, so to kind of go in and to see what's changed, try to delve into it and understand kind of patterns over time. So, where did that come from? So we can see where they might have come from. We can see, all right, where did they go? And that's useful. So kind of thinking about analytics as an exploration is certainly more useful than it is therapy. But it still it's a hard way to try to corral the kind of the insanity of data that is Google Analytics. It's much easier to think about how to build this into kind of your working life if you think about it as a tool for action. So we're not just kind of showing up on analytics and saying, what's going on? But instead we're saying, okay, what can we provide that will drive a lot of people to our site? We're defining some kind of action question that we then use analytics to help provide data on. So here's, for instance, a possible process to use here. So we're going to start by defining our question. We're going to explore things around it. We're going to hypothesize. We're going to take action. We're going to measure. So me and Beth Cantor actually developed this presentation originally a long time ago, and me and her went through this and looked at it and said, we've just redefined the scientific methodology for web analytics. So anyway, this is the scientific methodology as applied to web analytics. So, for instance, here are some action questions. So here are some things that you might start with. If I'm going to invest in more resources, so I'm going to create more content on more questions, what should I spend it on? What are people most likely to find useful? What features are most likely to inspire people to donate? Are we getting a return on our investment for specific things? So we've created this big new intake process. Are enough people actually using it to actually make it worth our while? Are people able to find a particular piece of important content? So these are questions that you could start out. So let's say going through an example of this, let's say I wanted to investigate the question, how can I get more people to view the donation report? Well, so technically the donation report is from 2005, so probably we wouldn't. But if we did, we could say, how many people are viewing the report now? Well, it's number 11. It's an old slide, but so it's number 11, say, at this point. So there's room for it to improve, and there's a lot of things that are ahead of it. Are there times when a lot of people looked at it? What can we glean from that information? What might have gone on those days? What links to the report are used the most? So this is a kind of a visualization of that click path thing that we saw. So basically, here's where people came from before they came to the report. So what paths are they using, and what can I learn from that? And more. So what external referrers are sending people to the site? What types of people are most likely to view it? And so I can use all of that information to hypothesize something. So, all right, so I think that if I move it up the home page or I add an image to make it more of a feature, that'll help. Maybe posting a blurb to a big discussion list will be useful. So you choose something, you follow through, and then you measure it to know whether or not it worked. So this seems almost overly simplistic, but I think that this is a really useful way to think. So to basically think of analytics as a cycle in which you are measuring things, you are doing something that you can potentially then, use to affect change on your site. And then you come back and measure it and see whether it worked. So it's not just kind of something that is giving you static information, but it is a living tool that helps you understand what is working and what is not working on your site. And just to keep in mind that if you are asking questions about your site, there's multiple ways to do that. So analytics aren't the only tool at your disposal. So you can think about surveys, for instance, interviews, focus groups. So in fact, analytics are really good at telling you kind of the what about your site, the what and how many. They're pretty bad at telling you the why, and the why can sometimes be really quite cryptic to try to figure out why people are doing what they're doing. And if you want to know the why, asking people is likely to give you more success than relying on analytics. So thinking about putting a survey on your site, like you can, for instance, do what's called an intercept survey, where you can pop it up when people enter your site or after a particular amount of time they spent on your site to ask them to take a survey to find out more about things like why they're there, whether they've achieved their goals, things like that. You can actually talk to people, to talk to clients one-on-one, to do focus groups, which are, to my mind, always really surprisingly useful. So talking to 5 people about what they want on your site is likely to glean you a lot of information. User testing is the same thing, but you sit them down in front of a computer and you ask them to potentially, try to find something on your site. Also a very useful tool. So just didn't want to leave you with the idea that analytics is the end-all, be-all of anything that you could do with the site. All right, and that brings us to the end of our regularly scheduled content. It's just a few wrap-up comments, and then would love to take any questions you have, or I'll ask a couple questions of Brian and Terry if you do not have them. So please, before you head out, do take the survey about this. Give us some feedback about the class at the survey link that Brian has added into the chat. We'd love to hear what you thought about this. Was it the right level? Was it too basic, too advanced? We're going to be doing a follow-up looking at case studies as to how organizations are actually using analytics coming up in about a month and a half. So we'd love your feedback on this one to make sure we can tailor that one.
Right. If you have specific questions or things, feel free to add those into the comment section of the survey, especially since we've got a kind of follow-up, more advanced case study on this same topic coming up in about a month and a half.
Fantastic. Great, and this would be a great time to enter any questions you have into the chat or hit *6 to unmute yourself. While we're waiting, I'm just going to ask Terry if she has any closing thoughts for us, so things for people to keep. Oh, I'm sorry, I said *7 rather than *6 to unmute. Any closing thoughts for us on things that people should keep in mind, Terry?
No, I have a couple of examples where analytics gave us some really useful information, specific examples. One is we have a piece of content around juvenile expungement, and someone in Chicago, a partner organization of ours, worked with a group of youth to develop a juvenile expungement app, is what they call it. It's actually a mobile website. It's called Expungio. We partnered with them in getting it out there, and they linked to us. And if you can filter specifically on that piece of content from Google Analytics, that how do I expunge my juvenile record content, you can see in the Google Analytics results how the referral visits just went through the roof for that particular piece of content. You can also see the organization that put the app out there has some context in some pretty big media outlets, and it got some coverage on some of the Chicago and East St. Louis stations. And you can also see in the analytics, again, on that spark line, how you can see when the story ran and the resulting increase in the page views to that piece of content as a result of the media coverage.
Great. So knowing that that's a really valuable partnership that you should definitely continue with. Absolutely. Great.
Yeah, Brian does mention something here that the turning the demographics on and updating that tracking can take a little while. It is something that you all also run into occasionally with Google Analytics generally, is that sometimes you will get a day or two delay in getting access to those stats. They've gotten much better at that recently.
that's actually an important point that I had forgotten to mention with just the entire idea of installing the code. The other thing about installing the code is that it will only track information from that point forward. So I suspect, I don't know for sure, but I suspect if we upgrade our code so that we get that demographic information like age or gender, we will likely only have age and gender information from the point at which we entered that code. And that's certainly true for anybody who hasn't set up Google Analytics yet, that we've been trolling through, years and years worth of Idealware analytics data, and that's because we've in fact had that piece of analytics code installed for years and years. If I had just put it in last week, we'd only have a week of data. So that's just an important thing to level set what you're going to get when you install that code. So certainly, if you install it today, you'll have a lot more next year than if you install it, 8 months from now. So.
Right, so don't delay is the answer. Don't delay, because otherwise you're not going to have any data for a while that's going to be useful for you in comparison.
Yep, absolutely. Great. All right. So I think that we are at an end. I don't see any more questions in the chat. Brian, any closing thoughts for us as we wind down?
I just want to remind people that we have a roundtable discussion next week over the proposed new baselines, and that all of our other trainings for the year are posted up on the LSNTAP website, including 4 more hosted by Idealware. Thank you guys all for coming out, and thank you both to Terry and to Laura for putting together a great presentation today.
Great.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much for coming, guys, and we'll hope to see you on another seminar soon.